In 1920s Australia, Bulimba Reach was a popular fishing spot for locals and tourists alike. Today, it is a premier suburb of Brisbane. Its streets are lined with cafes, restaurants, and boutiques. Public jetties offering ferries to the other side of the river are dotted along the riverside, and waterfront walking tracks are busy with pedestrians and cyclists. On the morning of Sunday, November 27, 1921, Herbert Jack and his friend Thompson decided to take their young sons fishing on the Brisbane River. The four of them headed down to Gay's Corner on the Bulimba Reach section of the Brisbane River. The river flows through the city of Brisbane and out into Moreton Bay. Herbert worked on the riverside in the suburb of New Farm. He was familiar with the water and frequently fished the area. It was planned to be an enjoyable morning out, but it turned into a tragic disaster. The group carried their fishing gear from their vehicle down to the riverbank. They were going to use their dinghy, which was moored just 10 yards from the bank. But first they had to get there. Although the water was only shallow, Herbert offered to carry his 8-year-old son, George, onto his shoulders and wade across to the boat. It was morning time. The sky was overcast and gray, but there were people out and about. Boats motored out to sea from the river, and people strolled along the riverbank. That particular section of the river was an area that was known to be frequented by sharks. At the time, a whaling station was situated at the mouth of the river in Moreton Bay. Whale carcasses were processed there. The blood, juices, and waste tissues were washed into the water, enticing sharks upstream from the open ocean. Even today, bull sharks are known to give birth to their pups in the river, and there are thought to be around 500 that frequent the estuarine waters of the Brisbane River. In fact, during a flood in 2010, a bull shark was seen swimming along the streets of the city. They are dangerous, aggressive, opportunistic hunters and are one of the most likely species to attack people. They are drawn to the estuary for the promise of abundant fish and other wildlife that they prey on. As Herbert stepped into the water with his son on his shoulders, he didn't know that there was a bull shark just yards upstream from him. He waded into the river, heading for the little boat that bobbed up and down on the surface. It was tied by its bow to a small buoy, securing it close to the shore. When Herbert was just yards from the bank and in 3 feet of water, he felt a sharp tug on his right hip. He immediately looked down and saw the terrifying head of a shark. Its skin was dark gray beneath the water. Its black eye looked up at him as it rolled onto its side, tearing Herbert's skin. He cried out in alarm and tried to free himself, shaking his leg and pulling away. He gripped his son's legs with his left hand, whilst punching the shark with his right. He brought his fist down heavily on top of the enormous fish again and again. It was like punching hard sandpaper. The skin was rough and abrasive, the snout of the shark hard and unforgiving. But the punching seemed to work. The shark let go for an instant, and Herbert thought that he was free and tried to turn back to the bank. But only a second later, the shark bit down again, this time biting his right buttock. With George on his shoulders, Herbert couldn't grapple with the shark very well, and he was struggling to keep his balance with the weight of his son on top of him. All he could do was continually hit the shark and hope that it let go long enough for him to make it back to the bank and dry land. In the midst of the attack, his friend Thompson ran into the water to help. The water was bubbling and boiling all around Herbert and George. The tail of the shark whipped up and out of the river as it thrashed around. With both men now hitting the shark, it let go for another second before raising its head up and out of the water and clamping its jaws down and around Herbert's right hand and lower arm. Herbert felt himself yanked and pulled towards the water. His face was just inches from the top of the shark's head as it pulled on his arm. The force of the animal was overpowering, and it felt as though it was going to rip Herbert's arm from his body. George began to slip and slide on his father's shoulders. Herbert couldn't hold on to him forever, and in all the commotion he was losing his grip on George. The water turned red as the shark continued to clamp its powerful jaws down around Herbert's arm, and Herbert couldn't hit the shark anymore, as he was using his other arm to hold onto his son. The more he tried to pull himself backwards and away from the shark, the more it tugged at him, threatening to pull him off his feet and under the water. It persisted in the attack, and moments later, Thompson flung himself at the shark. Miraculously, it released its grip around the young father, but when it let go, Herbert stumbled slightly, and, in a heart-stopping moment, George fell from his shoulders. The two men watched in shock as the 8-year-old hit the water with a loud smack. Before they could grab the youngster and pull him out of the water, the shark wheeled around and came back again. This time it grabbed onto George, and he let out a terrified yell as he was dragged underwater. The two men tried to fight the shark off, but it dived below the surface with young George in its jaws. Frantically, Thompson searched for George below the water, but there was no sign of him. He had disappeared into the depth of the river. Only the ripples from the attack remained. All was silent for a second. Then, moments later, the boy resurfaced. He was still alive, but only just. His head bobbed above the river's surface for a split second that forever haunted those who witnessed it. The shark had let go of him for a moment, and he coughed and spluttered above the water, holding his arms out to Herbert and Thompson, a desperate look in his eyes. The two men rushed over to him, but before they could reach him, the dorsal fin of the shark broke through the surface of the water. It was coming back for the boy. It hadn't finished with him yet. In the most heartbreaking moment for Herbert, he watched, helpless, as the gray head of the shark emerged once more and grabbed George. The boy was dragged under the water again. This time, he didn't resurface. The two men screamed into the water, desperate to get George back, but there was nothing they could do, and Herbert was losing blood fast. A police launch boat happened to motor past them, and they shouted at them to help. They immediately launched a search for George, scouring the length of the river, peering into the depths, and searching along the riverbank in case he had made it out. But it was no use. He had been taken by the shark, likely to the depths of the river or out towards the open sea. He was never seen again, and an extensive search for his body found nothing. Herbert had lost his son in the most horrific way imaginable, but he still had to fight for his own life. The shark had taken a deep bite out of his right thigh and buttock. It had severed the skin and muscle on his right hand and arm, all the way up to his elbow. As he stood in shock in the waist-high water, blood dripped into the river, turning it red all around him. The polluted water was washing the open wounds. Bacteria were entering his bloodstream, and he needed urgent medical attention. The police had called emergency services, and Herbert was rushed to Brisbane General Hospital. He was in bad shape and spent the night in critical condition. His family and friends didn't know if he was going to make it. Not only had he lost a significant amount of blood from the attack, but his body was infected from the shark bite and the polluted river water. He was at risk of sepsis and blood poisoning. The following day, the gaping wounds on his leg, buttock, and arm were sutured back up, and a drain fitted for all the excess fluid. But the wounds were the least of his worries. His temperature was soaring as his body tried to stave off infection. Doctors tried to stabilize him and keep the infection from taking over. His temperature gradually came down over the following days. But just when it was starting to ease and looked like things were heading in the right direction, it soared back up again, threatening to take his life. A week after the attack, Herbert underwent another surgery to try and keep the infection at bay. He was watched and monitored closely by hospital staff and was finally discharged from hospital on February 21, 1922, 3 months after the attack. Despite surviving this horrific attack, he was devastated. He put all the blame on himself for not being able to protect his son that day. Not a day goes by without that tragic day replaying in his mind, the day his son, George Jack, met his terrifying final affliction. Christian Prinsloo was visiting his grandmother for the 2-week school holiday that began at the end of March. In South Africa, This is a busy time for most adults, since business and work goes on just as it usually would. Luckily, Christian had plenty of family and cousins that he could go visit during the holidays, but he opted to stay with his maternal grandmother instead. Mari Stridham, even though she was 75 years old, she and Christian were very close to each other, and the boy genuinely enjoyed spending time with her. But there was another reason that Christian, or Tien, like everyone called him, liked to visit his gran. Mari lived in Elisras, a town in the north of South Africa, just a stone's throw from the Botswana border. Elisras has a large farming community with little acreages dotting the outskirts of the town for miles, and Mari was well ingrained in the community. They had nearly daily trips out to visit one friend or another, Mari usually checking in on the older members of the community if they were sick or just needed a bit of company. Tien spent those drives absorbing all of the books that the town's library had to offer, while he eagerly awaited the next stop and the next adventure. Most of those plots and farms had at least half a dozen interesting animals on it, and the residents never had a shortage of cookies and treats for the polite young man who was always willing to lend a helping hand where he could. One acreage took in abandoned gazelle calves, another had cages full of rabbits and guinea pigs, and yet another had a troop of meerkats that liked to sneak into the farm owner's house to wreak havoc. It was every 11-year-old's dream holiday, but none was more interesting than the plot they were visiting on that April in 2017. This couple kept real-life lions. It might sound extreme to us, but there are quite a few such places in South Africa. Usually, people raise abandoned cubs by hand, either to extend breeding programs, to reintroduce them into areas where inbreeding or poaching has affected the big cat populations, or just to sell off to private collectors and zoos around the world. It's a dangerous profession, but one that's taken very seriously, and always with the magnificent animal's future at the forefront. On this little patch of land, there were 3 fully grown lions, all hand-raised and about as close to tame as a wild cat could come. Tien had even played with a few cubs that found their way there before they were taken to their new homes, but these 3 had been on the property so long that it was by now their permanent home. Each had its own spacious cage, and every morning at late afternoon they were given free rein of the fenced-in 4 acres to stretch their legs, roll in the ground, and sharpen their nails on the massive mulberry trees all over the property. Their owners never allowed visitors to come over during the lions' free time, and only the husband and wife ever fed them. But by the time Tien and his gran arrived, they'd already been out for their walk and had been fed and returned to their holdings, so there was no danger to either of them being on the property at that time, or at least that's what they thought. Mari and Tien spent a few minutes chatting with the owner's wife, whose husband was out of town. Mari had known the couple for years, and so did Tien. This was just a social call to catch up over a cup of tea and to make sure that all was well with the woman who was alone so far out of town. While Mari busied herself in the kitchen with making tea for all of them, the wife stepped away to attend to an errand at the back of the house, leaving Mari and Tien in the kitchen. Tien, returning the milk to the fridge, didn't see the adult African lion poke his nose into the open kitchen door. Apparently, someone had not closed its heavy metal gate properly, and predictably, it used its newfound freedom to come to investigate Mari and Tien's unfamiliar scents. Mari saw it immediately, and as soon as her eyes fell on the creature, she moved in between her grandson and the beast in one swift motion. Tien heard her call out to him softly, and to his horror he saw what was standing right in the kitchen door. Tien was not some uninformed child. He knew full well that no matter how much a lion's been in contact with humans, it's never truly tame. The ice-cold fear that coursed through him was nearly enough to fossilize him where he stood. But his grandmother, calm and without taking her eyes off the cat, told him to get out of the kitchen and into the safety of the house. Tien did as he was told, but he wasn't as calm as Mari. Tian spun around and began to run. The moment he did, he became just another gazelle fleeing from a hunter, just like any other prey running for their lives. And even though the lion was well fed and not at all hungry, all of its natural instincts kicked into gear. In that instant, it sprang into action, knocking Mari to the ground, and with 2 strides it leapt through the air, landing on Tian's back before the boy even made it halfway across the kitchen. Its nails wrapped around his tiny shoulders, and its teeth sank into the back of Tian's neck and upper back. This male was on the younger side, its mane just having grown in fully, and it had never hunted before in its entire life. Had this been an experienced hunter, that bite would have been well aimed and it wouldn't have missed the jugular. Its full weight and the speed with which it had come at the 11-year-old slammed him to the ground with such force that 2 of his ribs and his nose broke instantly. Mari moved faster than a woman her age was supposed to. One moment the beast and the boy were on the ground, and the next, Mari was on top of them. She grabbed the mane, pulling as hard as she could. The cat let go of Tian, gave an angry swipe in her direction, and turned back to its prey. Mari didn't even feel the nails raking over her forearm and shoulder. She just launched herself back at the cat, completely disregarding its growls and teeth. On its back, she yanked and pulled, screaming in primal maternal anger. The noise had alerted the homeowner, and the woman came bursting into the kitchen just as Mari launched her second attempt to pull the animal off her grandson. The woman's yells were familiar enough to pull the lion out of its natural prey drive. It pulled out its nails from the boy's back and began to backtrack toward the open door, throwing Mari off its back in the process. Mari didn't wait for the tiles to get warm beneath her. Slipping on her and her grandson's blood, she scrambled to Tian's unmoving body. The homeowner ran after the lion, got it back in its cage, and ran back to the house with the intention of calling an ambulance. But Mari was one step ahead of her. She'd grabbed the car keys off the counter, threw them at her friend, and picked up Tian like he weighed nothing. The adrenaline was fueling her now. Even at 75, with her own wounds and her age dragging her down, she suddenly could have been 20 years old again. It took them 20 minutes to reach the nearest hospital, and there the damage was starkly clear. The back of Tian's neck and his back were shredded beyond repair. He was completely unresponsive, and his breathing was shallow. Besides patching up the deepest scratches to slow the bleeding and to get him on a transfusion, all that the small-town hospital could do was wait for the helicopter to arrive to airlift Tian to Pretoria City, where the best surgeons and specialists were already waiting. Mari, on the other hand, refused all treatment, insisting to stay with her grandson. It wasn't until the aircraft disappeared into the horizon that she finally collapsed from exhaustion and grief that staff were able to stitch her up. Her wounds were deep, but not fatal, and she was released within a few days. Tian was whisked into surgery the moment he arrived, but his condition was too dire. Unless a miracle happened, there was no waking up from the intense damage that his spinal cord received. The connection between the brain and the rest of the body was severed when those teeth gripped down his spine. For 3 weeks, Tian remained in his comatose state. He was kept breathing by the machines that beeped away in the background. His parents, Herman and Adri Prinsloo, kept vigil at his bedside, begging the public for prayers, while their only child showed no signs of brain activity. 3 weeks of hell later, and Tian died just 1 day after his 12th birthday. Mari made a full recovery, but she never stopped reliving the trauma of that day. And as for the lion, in a rare twist of events, the Prinsloo family did not wish for it to be put down. They recognized that it was only acting on instinct, driven by forces beyond its control. It was rehomed to another facility or park that's never been disclosed. They did not wish to pursue legal action. They realized that it was a mistake, and whether or not it was negligence or fate, a battle in the courts would never return their sweet, animal-loving boy back from his terrifying, final affliction. The city of Anchorage has the most population in the entire state, making it the chief commercial center. It lies at the base of the Chugach Mountains, a section of western North America's Pacific mountain range entirely contained inside the U.S. state of Alaska. The intrinsically delicate balance of the urban pillars in the foreground meeting the unsullied mountains of Chugach is the perfect symbolism for this city, a place anchored between nature and culture. Naturally, the people here have a heart for nature and love experiencing the beautiful landscape. Bird Ridge Mountain is one of the most popular sites where people can bathe their senses in the brilliant ecosystem. It is located southeast of Anchorage, along the Turnagain arm of Cook Inlet. It is home to the Robert Spur Memorial Hill event. This annual 3,400-foot uphill race climbs through the coastal forest to the tundra atop Bird Ridge Mountain, where people get an excellent view of the Turnagain arm and the surrounding mountains. On June 18, 2017, Father's Day, the Robert Spur Memorial Hill climb was celebrating its 29th year. It was a relatively cloudy day in Anchorage. Since the early morning, the sun had been overcast by the dull gray clouds. It loomed over the Cooper residence. Patrick Cooper and his mother, Katrina, had just finished their preparations for the race. Katrina carefully instructed Patrick on where to go, what to do, and how to stay away from the highway. With all the details ironed out, it was time for them to head out. It was 9:30 a.m., and nothing was seemingly out of the ordinary. Patrick was excited to participate in this race, as he was naturally competitive with all the school activities he had joined. Running this trail with his mother was extra special. Patrick would be joining the juniors division of the race, while Katrina would be in the adult division. It was a few minutes before they began. Patrick and Katrina, along with the other participants, had just arrived at the starting point. Unbeknownst to the Coopers, this event would change their lives forever. Katrina switched her phone to airplane mode, saving as much battery life as she could while the race was ongoing. Patrick was beside her, lightly springing with eagerness as he was having the time of his life. When Patrick was born at the Providence, Alaska Medical Center, he spent nearly 2 months in the neonatal intensive care unit. Born a premature baby, Patrick had a lot of problems and disabilities. Eventually, the doctors discovered he had a seizure disorder, autism, and ADHD. After being released from the hospital, Patrick spent another 2 months with his birth family. However, his parents, being disabled people themselves, eventually realized they were inadequately equipped to care for Patrick's special needs. They came to the difficult conclusion of putting him up for adoption. Eventually, Patrick met the Coopers, and Katrina and her then-husband Dave were immediately awestruck at the young boy's bright energy. Although Patrick had challenges, he did not let them stop him from enjoying life. He was a bright character. He liked to run and often competed with the fastest kids. He fished, inner tubed at the lake, and was an immense hockey fan who would watch the games with his family. Chess and Monopoly were big in the Cooper household, eventually turning Patrick into a massive fan of the games. Patrick may have experienced some difficulties at school. However, he did not let that affect his progress. At the time of the race, he had just finished 10th grade. Although a little bit gassed out, Katrina and Patrick reached halfway up the grueling foot race. The 16-year-old boy beamed a smile toward his mother as they approached the end of the junior version of the race. Reaching the end, Patrick had to say goodbye to Katrina for now. The boy looked at his adoring mother and gave her another beaming smile. Katrina put her arm around the boy, calling him her little mountain goat. She told him they'll see each other again later, since the adults' finish line was atop the steep mountain slope. After one last look at him, Katrina said goodbye and proceeded to head up the trail again. Patrick began to head back down the trail along with the other kids. Unfortunately, this was the last time Katrina would see her son alive. The downhill trail was a less challenging route, but it was by no means easier. However, the other kids accompanying Patrick made the time pass by more quickly. They chatted and laughed. They celebrated that the hard part of the race was already finished. The carefree atmosphere among the kids was infectious, and Patrick lost focus. Coming upon a confusing junction along the trail, Patrick decided to take a different turn away from the other kids. Unfortunately, it was a wrong and fatal turn. Here, nobody was walking alongside Patrick. He noticed the vegetation got denser as he trudged along the route, not connected to the race circuit. He continued to descend the trail and things became quieter. As the laughing of the young participants faded slowly in the background, The hush of the Alaskan wilderness became more prominent. Patrick could hear the rustling of the leaves as he stepped on them. Unwittingly walking farther down the trail, Patrick heard sounds in the bushes. At the same time, he finally realized nobody was walking with him anymore, prompting him to pause and attempt to rejoin the group. However, they were nowhere to be found. Suddenly, from a few feet away, Patrick noticed something hiding in the bushes, a massive black silhouette. The 16-year-old boy unintentionally crossed paths with a black bear. The creature blocked the path Patrick came from, effectively separating him farther away from the crowd. Patrick paced deeper into the wrong trail as the bear sized him up, stalking and following his every step. The young boy felt the dread looming over him. Patrick paced his steps more quickly and began to reach for his phone. Alarmed by the dire situation, Patrick texted his mother and brother but got no response from them. As he watched the bear carefully, Patrick left out a few voicemails. The bear eventually made its move and charged toward Patrick. It advanced with such speed, the distance between them seemed nothing. Patrick was sweating up a storm as he sensed the danger he was in. Fully panicked at this point, Patrick turned his back and decided to make a run for it. Unfortunately, it was a big mistake. The bear's senses quickly turned predatory. The worst mistake a person can make when encountering any predator is to attempt to outrun the creature. Predators operate more dangerously when they know their prey has no chance against them. And with his back against the bear, Patrick was an easy target. With its big and powerful legs, the bear pounced on the young boy, mauling him and quickly dragging him away. The creature used its powerful paws laced with 2-inch claws to hold him down. The bear began biting Patrick, chewing at his legs, face, and arms with its 3-inch canines that could snap bones in half. The young Patrick had no chance at all. Back at the starting area, Katrina noticed something was amiss. Patrick was not there when he should have reached the meetup point before her. Patrick's brother Jesse informed her of what happened. After receiving the distressing call from his brother, Jesse notified Brad Prikoski, the race director, about the situation. Brad immediately alerted race crews to search for Patrick. Katrina was understandably shocked, and she immediately joined in the search. Unfortunately, after a few hours, some responders were able to locate Patrick. He was already lifeless, and the black bear was still on top of him, guarding his kill. Immediately, a Chugach State Park ranger shot the bear in the face. However, it wasn't enough to kill it, prompting the creature to get away. As Patrick's remains were airlifted from the scene, the Coopers could do nothing but weep at his horrible fate. "We are all better people for the honor of having him in our lives. He will be dearly missed," said Patrick's family. The authorities scoured the area for the bear and were able to kill a 250-pound male black bear. They noticed it had been shot with a slug in the face, concluding they got the bear that killed Patrick. Experts weighing in on the case deemed the incident a rare predatory attack. The bear was not defending its cubs or a kill. It just so happened that it saw Patrick as an easy target, taking yet another amazing person to meet their unfortunate final affliction. There are thousands of polar bears in Alaska, but despite this, attacks on humans are incredibly rare. Polar bears are apex predators, hunting seals, young walruses, and even sometimes beluga whales and narwhals. But occasionally they stumble into local communities on the search for food. In the small village of Wales, located on the Seward Peninsula on the western coast of Alaska, tragedy struck in January 2023. The close-knit community of about 150 people were going about their daily lives. The village, the westernmost on North America's mainland, overlooks the Bering Strait. The small settlement is rich in its cultural heritage. It is one of the most isolated settlements in America, a frozen landscape, a tundra of ice and snow. The weather had been terrible for the past few days. Strong winds whipped up ground-lying snow, creating whiteout conditions. The people of Wales were used to this. It was common for supplies to dwindle before planes flew in to restock. Once the entire community ran out of toilet paper, They didn't see a plane or helicopter for 6 weeks. That was part of the life here. The harsh conditions, but also the magical beauty of the landscape, relatively untouched by man, a wilderness that beckons adventure and the exploration of the great outdoors. Summer Myomic, a 24-year-old mother and popular member of the community, was braving the elements. She was walking with her 1-year-old son, Clyde Angtawasruk. It was January 17th, 2:30 in the afternoon. The pair were walking between the small school and medical clinic. There was nothing unusual about the day. The route Summer took was routine and unremarkable, but camouflaged against the backdrop of white was a predator, an apex predator that was top of the food chain. It was looking for a meal. It stalked towards the village. Its paws, 12 inches, 30 centimeters across, and bearing 2-inch claws, trod firmly on the ground. Its lumbering gait was hidden from view by the poor visibility. It was making its way closer to the village. With every step, it was closer to its kill. It was a large polar bear. It stopped momentarily, raised its head, and sniffed the air. Its keen sense of smell had drawn it towards the village. Perhaps the scent of garbage had wafted on the air. Perhaps the smell of food or humans had enticed it inland. Able to detect a seal 1 mile away and hidden under 3 feet of snow, polar bears have an acute sense of smell. They are almost impossible to hide from outside in the elements. Sprinting at up to 25 miles per hour, you can't outrun them. Standing up to 3 meters on their hind legs, you can't fight them off. They are a formidable predator. Summer was just yards from Wales' Kingikmuit school gates when she heard a commotion. The bear had entered the village. Screams rang out as terrified locals made a dash for cover. A house, a shop, a car. Unbeknown to Summer, the polar bear was on a rampage. It chased people as it thundered through the streets. It was hungry. It was on the prowl. When it spotted an easy meal, it made a run for it, its huge, powerful body racing towards unsuspecting residents. But for Summer, who was just passing by the school, she had nowhere to hide, nowhere to run, and the polar bear spotted her outside the school gates. It ran at her, slowly at first, and then gaining speed. Its eyes were fixed on the young mother and her baby. Fearless and powerful, it came in for the kill. In a moment of panic, a moment of sheer terror, children inside the school grounds began screaming. They could see the menacing bear coming in for the attack. It leapt onto Summer, knocking her to the ground. There was nothing she could have done. There was nothing young Clyde could have done. The pair were in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were no match for a 1,500-pound, 700-kilogram bear. Teachers from the school came running outside. They had heard the commotion. They could hear the screams from their terrified pupils and the cries from Summer and her boy. As the polar bear launched its attack, the teachers grabbed the children and rushed them inside. But the bear spotted them. It had made a kill and now it wanted more. It ran at the school doors, trying to force its way inside. The head teacher, Dawn Hendrickson, slammed the school door shut, bolting it from the inside. The polar bear's powerful front paws rapped on the door. Would the door hold its weight, or would it buckle, allowing the bear to enter and wreak havoc amongst staff and students there? They all held their breath, not daring to move, not daring to utter a sound. The young children's faces were a picture of terror, their eyes wide open, their hearts in their mouths, as their teachers tried their best to keep them quiet. Staff locked the school down. They remained silent, listening, waiting, hoping upon hope that the door would hold out, that the bear would leave them alone. They drew the blinds on the windows. The bear couldn't see in. The people couldn't see out. They managed to get word to the community that there was a bear on the loose. A short while later, staff and students heard the crack of a loud gunshot from outside. Peering through the window blinds, they could see the polar bear. It lay slumped on the ground outside the school gates. It lay motionless, still. It was dead. The weather had been so bad that Wales had been inaccessible. Strong winds and blizzards had caused whiteout conditions. Lights on the gravel runway were undetectable. When weather is good, up to 6 small planes land on the gravel each day. But this lifeline to the outside world is tenuous. It is often cut when weather is bad. This time, help was a day away. State troopers arrived at the scene the next day. The attack on Summer was a haunting reminder of how fragile life is. She and her young son had their lives ripped away from them in a terrible way. Until then, locals had lived without fear from attack for more than 30 years. Despite being on the fringes of the Arctic Circle, polar bear sightings within the village are rare, and attacks even more so. The district's chief school administrator, Susan Nedza, described the community as dealing with crippling grief. Summer was a much-liked young lady. She was sweet and kind, a devoted mother. The school was closed to the lessons for the rest of the week, but it was left open as a refuge for those who tried to come to terms with what happened on its doorstep. The school provided meals and counseling for those in need, people coming together at a time of grief. Jeff York, Senior Director of Conservation at Polar Bears International, was shocked and surprised by the attack. When asked to comment on the bear's behavior, he stated that the bear must have been desperate for it to have chased multiple people. It wasn't an opportunistic attack. It was in the village to make a kill, and it would stop at nothing until it had done so. Although immediately north and south of Wales, there is now water at that time of year instead of ice due to a warming climate, there is still plenty of ice close by for the bears to hunt on. It's very unusual for a polar bear to leave its typical hunting ground to search elsewhere. It doesn't make sense. But with less sea ice encouraging polar bears to hunt ashore and more human activity in the Arctic, attacks are on the rise. Community members in Wales developed a polar bear patrol program to keep its residents safe. Unfortunately, this was discontinued due to a lack of funding, a decision that had resulted in a mother and her 1-year-old son meeting their unfortunate final affliction. Prospect Park Zoo in Brooklyn was once on the list for the top 10 worst zoos in America. The animals were kept in small cages or in pit-style enclosures. They were offered little stimulation or environmental enrichment, but provided entertainment for the thousands of visitors that had entered its gates since the 1930s. In May 1987, just as the zoo closed up for the day, 3 young boys walked around its perimeter. They were on a mission, a mischievous mission that was both exciting and adventurous, but it was also dangerous. They planned to sneak into the zoo and swim around the seal moat. It was a silly dare the 10 and 11-year-olds had come up with, though it would be one that would cost one of them his life. The security team began their patrol, and the night watchman on duty paced near the zoo's entrance. But the boys had found another way in. A small hole in the perimeter fencing was just big enough for the youngsters to crawl through. They knelt down, hardly daring to breathe as they tugged at the fencing a little. Then they pulled themselves through on their tummies and stepped inside. All was quiet. A few workers remained on site, but the hustle and bustle from the visiting public had died down now. The boys made their way to the seal enclosure, but on the way, they spotted something else. Another enclosure, the polar bear exhibit. This also had a moat around it, but this one was far more dangerous. It was far more exciting for the 3 young boys. They dared each other to climb in and swim around the polar bear's moat. It was the ultimate challenge. The night watchman and security team were on the lookout that night, as they were every night. They had driven past the polar bear enclosure at 5:15 that evening and again at 5:45. They were due back there 2 hours later as they patrolled the park. They were aware of break-ins during out-of-hours and often had to chase youngsters out of the park at night. So far, none had been stupid enough to breach any of the animal enclosure fences, but that was about to change. These 3 boys were up for the polar bear challenge, and each agreed to it. They stripped their clothes off, removing their trousers and shoes, ready for their daring swim. All 3 of them were giggling with excitement. They couldn't see the polar bears at the time, as they were in their cave, but they knew they were in there. They just needed to scale the wrought iron fence and drop down on the other side. Then they needed to swim around the moat before climbing back out. That was the plan. It would be an excellent story to tell their friends. To have swum in the polar bear enclosure was only for the bravest of boys. 11-year-old Juan picked up all their clothes and threw them into the enclosure. There was no going back now. He began to climb the metal fence. He pulled himself upwards, scraping his hands on the bars. At the top, he managed to climb up and over the outwards pointing sharp metal points. He teetered on the top of the fence, waiting for his friends to catch him up. One of them backed down and remained on the ground, but the other scaled the fence with Juan. They looked down into the enclosure below. It was surrounded on 3 sides by the moat, had 8-foot iron fences around it, and was backed by a 20-foot cliff. The boys' clothes lay in a pile on the concrete. Juan dropped down, closely followed by his other friend. They were inside. They had made it. Now, the real challenge began. The dare was to swim in the moat. The 2 boys walked forwards, whilst their friend watched on the other side of the bars. Juan stepped into the moat, but his friend decided against it. It was too dangerous. He headed back to the fence, while Juan proceeded through the water. He half waded, half swam across to the other side. The water was cold. A shudder ran down his spine. By now, the commotion the boys had created had alerted the enclosure's residents. 1,200-pound, 540-kilogram Teddy and 900-pound, 400-kilogram Lucy. The bears stirred from their den and came outside to investigate. They lifted their heads upwards and sniffed the air. Then they turned and looked at the boys. They had been at the zoo for more than 20 years. Born in 1964 and transferred to the zoo the following year, that enclosure was all they had known. They had never encountered anyone else or anything else in their territory before, so this had come as a shock. How were they going to react in this new situation? Would their natural instincts kick in? By now, Juan had swum across the moat to the other side. He had climbed out, and when he stood up, dripping wet, he saw the enormous polar bears. The first bear did nothing. It just stood, staring at the boy. But the other polar bear reacted differently. Upon spotting the intruder, the male polar bear immediately clambered down a rocky outcrop towards the boy. It lumbered towards him with the characteristic gait of a polar bear, its head swinging slightly from side to side, its huge paws placed carefully in front of it with each step. An impressive beast, powerful and strong. Juan felt the adrenaline surging through his veins. His heart thumped loudly in his ears. He felt sheer terror as the enormous predator came closer and closer. He froze, visibly shaking where he stood. He didn't try to run. He didn't try to hide. Instead, the small 11-year-old froze to the spot as the polar bear lunged at him. It grabbed him in its jaws and shook him violently. His friends screamed as they watched on in horror. The boys' cries were heard by staff at the zoo. They knew something terrible must have happened. Children had been sneaking into the zoo recently, and the security guards were constantly patrolling the zoo at night. It was now 7 p.m., 2 hours since the zoo had closed, and the blood-curdling screams meant only one thing, that someone was in serious trouble. They followed the sound of the desperate cries and dialed 911. As their friend was being mauled to death, the other 2 boys made a run for it, 2 partially naked boys fleeing into the night. When the zoo staff arrived at the polar bear exhibit, they could see the male polar bear dragging Juan's body across the enclosure. The boy was limp and lifeless. Emergency services and armed officers arrived on scene. What they found was deeply disturbing. There, just outside the polar bear den, were the 2 polar bears. Both were growling and fighting over the remains of the boy, tussling over the body. Only his upper half was left, and they pulled at it, each trying to keep it for themselves. It was a gruesome sight. There was no hope for the boy. It was clear to the officers that he was dead. They saw the pile of clothes scattered about on the ground and the blood on the polar bear's white fur. The scene they were faced with was deeply concerning. They suspected that there might be other children inside the enclosure. They found 3 pairs of trousers, a pair of trainers, and 2 unmatched shoes inside the compound. They thought more children might be hiding inside the cave, and so made the decision to shoot the bears. It took 20 blasts from 12-gauge shotguns firing rifled slugs and 6 bullets from a .38 caliber revolver to kill the bears. Finally, they fell to the ground, quiet and still. It was a sad end to their tragic lives. Protests broke out over the killing of the bears, and the zoo came under fire, as it had done so many times before, for its lack of welfare towards the animals in its care. That very same evening, at 11 p.m., an autopsy was performed on the bears. Officers and zoo staff wanted to make sure that they had only killed one child and not any more. They didn't yet understand the whole story. When they cut the bears open, they found the remains of Juan and no one else. When the bears were dead, they scoured the enclosure to check for more bodies, just to make sure no more were found. Later, the parents of Juan's 2 friends called police to inform them what had happened. That's when the 2 boys were interviewed and were able to reveal the true horror of the story, a silly dare that went horribly, horribly wrong. Prospect Park Zoo was closed to the public a year later, in 1988. The cages and pit enclosures were completely demolished, along with most of the interior buildings. The zoo had long needed an overhaul. The conditions the animals had been kept in for more than 50 years were appalling. Empty beer cans and smashed wine bottles were strewn about some of the enclosures. The animals were injured by their inadequate housing. There were reports of staff mistreating and even killing some of the animals. And now, finally, something was being done about it. During the renovation works, the animals were rehoused across America. Then, 5 years and $37 million later, the newly named Prospect Park Wildlife Conservation Center reopened. It was the fresh start the zoo needed. The conditions the animals were kept in were greatly improved, and the center had a new focus: to educate young people about wildlife and its conservation. A positive ending to an otherwise horrible story. Juan and 2 polar bears meeting their preventable final affliction. Many different things can trigger a shark attack, although some are less well known than others. We're all familiar with the stories of surfers being attacked because they look like seals from below, and we know that a splashing motion can attract sharks, thinking it's a struggling or injured animal. Aside from the obvious, there's new research that is still taking place to suggest some other triggers for shark attacks, such as blood in the water, or more strangely, human urine. This may explain why 7-year-old Alicia Webster was attacked while swimming in New Zealand. The event has certainly sparked some controversy regarding why some sharks attack humans. New Zealand is not exactly famed for its shark attacks, with the country having a low occurrence rate and only a couple of reports annually. That being said, there are over 70 shark species that inhabit their waters, including the infamously dangerous great white shark, which may convince some people to stay out of the water altogether. For others, the ocean offers an escape. Sailors in particular love to make the most of their time on the open ocean. The Webster family were avid sailors who, in 2005, decided to take their yacht to Malakula so that they could have some time away from home on the boat. They shared the yacht with the Morecambe family, who they had a common love for sailing with. They had borrowed each other's boats in the past, but recently had decided that they should simply share a boat, and then they could also go on holiday together. This trip, however, was just for family, so Alicia was going to spend as much time with her parents, siblings, and grandparents as possible. As the family arrived at Malakula with their yacht, they were immediately disappointed by the weather, which was particularly cloudy and gave the island a gloomy look. They landed on the shore and were immediately greeted by Le Pen Tillison, who was a teacher living on the island. He saw Alicia swimming in the water and warned the family that they shouldn't allow their daughter to swim in the ocean, as it was a popular area for sharks. He explained that many fishing boats regularly came to stop in this area, which attracted the attention of sharks who wanted an easy meal. As a result, he never let his children swim in the sea. There were various freshwater places nearby that would be much safer, and so Le Pen suggested that the family move away from the beach in search of these areas. They agreed that they would want to keep their daughter safe, and so moved inland to have lunch away from the water's edge. However, once they were finished eating, the family returned to the water despite the warnings. Le Pen came back to the family to warn them once again of the dangers that the sharks would pose to them. They told Alicia to get out of the water again, but this time seemed annoyed with Le Pen's interruptions and hoped that they would be left alone if they complied with his warnings. Satisfied that they understood the dangers, Le Pen returned to his home and continued with his day, leaving the family to relax on the beach. However, the family would soon make a devastating mistake, which would cost little Alicia her life. After Le Pen was out of sight, Grant and Cherie Webster told their daughter that she could return to the water, as they were convinced that Le Pen was exaggerating. There were plenty of other local children that were playing in the water, so why should their daughter be excluded after they sailed all the way here? They sat on the shore as they watched their daughter paddle in the shallows, happy that they had raised such a water-confident child. She loudly announced to them that she needed to pee, and they assured her that it was okay if she peed in the ocean. That's where it would end up eventually anyways. They kept an eye on her, but trusted that she was fine. She was used to the water after all. They were more preoccupied with the local children, who looked a bit scared about something, while quickly trying to get out of the water. The parents watched them with interest, but when they turned back to Alicia, she was nowhere to be seen. How was that possible? They had only looked away for a second, and she was only a few meters into the water, barely deep enough to reach her stomach. As they scanned the water for any sign of her, she burst through the water and back to the surface screaming. Alicia's father, Grant, leapt into action and sprinted towards his screaming daughter. He pulled her out of the water and laid her on the sand, desperately trying to stop the blood that was pouring from her leg. Everyone was panicking. The children were running from the water in fear, trying to escape the blood that was gradually turning the shoreline red. Alicia had been attacked by a shark, that much was clear, but her parents still couldn't figure out the details of the attack. They hadn't even seen the shark that had grabbed her. All that mattered at this point was to try and save their daughter. Her left leg had been completely severed at the thigh, along with several bite wounds across her entire left side. She was bleeding profusely and growing colder with every second, so they knew they didn't have much time. Grant picked her up, and together, the parents used a dinghy from their yacht to take Alicia back to the mainland. Once they arrived at the shore, they flagged down a lorry and begged the driver to take them to a hospital. Upon seeing the pale and motionless child presented to him, the driver took them to the closest hospital, 30 minutes away. Unfortunately, after arriving at the hospital nearly an hour later, Alicia was pronounced dead on arrival. There was nothing to be done. Her family was beside themselves with grief and blamed themselves for not heeding the advice of Le Pen, who told them of the dangers that hid beneath the waves. If only they had listened. After it was announced that the child had died, the locals were heartbroken. They tried to identify the shark that was responsible for the attack, but no one had been able to see the attack except Alicia, so there was no way to know the species. In the days following the attack, local canoeists reported seeing a large tiger shark patrolling the waters where the girl was attacked, leading many to believe that this was the shark responsible. Although possible, a great white shark was also spotted just 2 days before the accident, so we will most likely never know. Her body was quickly returned home with her family so that they were able to pay their respects and remember their child as the happy, carefree child that she was, rather than the horrific way in which she died. Despite these details, we still don't know one of the most important details. Why did the mystery shark attack little Alicia to begin with? There is one theory that is widely debated, that is relevant to this case in particular. Are sharks attracted to human urine, and could this be a cause for an attack? It is widely explained that while sharks are attracted to the scent of blood in the ocean, they are not as interested in urine, as it doesn't indicate that someone is injured in the same way that blood would. That being said, sharks have a highly developed sense that they use to hunt, meaning that they are high-tuned to any and all bodily fluids that may enter the water. So by urinating in the ocean, Alicia may have alerted the shark that killed her of her presence in the water, which led it to coming to investigate. Other swimmers reported feeling the shark pass below them without attacking them, so it is strange that the animal seemingly beelined to Alicia. If it was just hunting, then it would have attacked the children in the deeper water, as it would have been able to easily overpower them and drag them underwater while it waited for them to drown. Instead, it chose a small girl who was near the shoreline, where it would be a less effective hunter and risk beaching itself. As a result, this had led some to speculate that this shark was attracted to her urine in the water. Although these claims are not backed up by scientific theory, some would argue that urine would actually dissuade a shark from attacking, as it would interfere with its ability to smell blood, its main target. However, the attack on Alicia begs to differ, and her death serves to remind people of the mystery of shark behavior. Next time you swim off to pee in the ocean, you may be unknowingly attracting your final affliction. At just 8 years old, Jeremy Williams attended his local Cougar elementary school, along with his 4-year-old brother Daniel. They were members of the native Cougar people. Their father also taught at the school in the isolated community on British Columbia's Vancouver Island. Belonging to a community steeped in tradition and rich in culture, Jeremy and Daniel were 2 of the 300 First Nation people living in the village. The rural, isolated community was situated 140 miles northwest of Victoria, surrounded by beautiful wilderness. Cougar is the most northwesterly contemporary settlement of the Nootka-speaking natives. It is a fishing village. The food of the ocean has provided for the community for generations. The First Nations people came there over 4,000 years ago. They were drawn by the rich sea life, natural resources, mild climate, and the beautiful surroundings. But in those surroundings were hidden dangers. Wild animals lurked. Most turned away at the first sight of a human, but for others, they were bold and brazen. They posed a real risk, especially to those who wandered off alone. The close proximity of the school to the wilderness was a concern for parents. They had repeatedly asked school governors to erect a fence around the school and its grounds. They knew that wild animals were common in the area, and they believed that it was only a matter of time before an attack on the school children. Sadly, they were right. During the recent weeks, there had been more and more cougar sightings on Vancouver Island. The cats were naturally curious animals, and some had little fear of humans. They approached walkers, cyclists, and even wildlife rangers. The advice was always to stand still, wave your arms above your head, and shout. Never turn your back on a cougar and try and throw something at it. Any small children should be picked up. Typically, they will run away. Usually, they are just interested in something you're carrying rather than you, such as food in your backpack. But if they see you as the prey, then that is a whole different story. A mountain lion that is stalking you is not merely curious, they want a meal. On a Tuesday morning in May 1992, Jeremy was playing with his brother Daniel and their 2 friends in the school playground. Their father, who was one of the teachers at the school, was inside the building. He could hear the children playing and would sometimes look out through the windows and catch his 2 boys running around with the others. But he wasn't the only one watching the children playing that morning. A cougar had been drawn to the shrieks and cries of the young children as they played outside during recess. Jeremy sat down on a grassy bank on the edge of the playground, whilst the other children continued to run around behind him. He looked out at the surrounding woodland, but he failed to spot the camouflaged cat in the undergrowth. The cougar locked its eyes onto the small boy. It was a female, just a yearling. She was likely hunting on her own for one of the first times. Mountain lions typically remain with their mothers until between the ages of 14 to 21 months. As a yearling, she can't have been independent for very long. She was an inexperienced hunter, but an opportunistic one of the most dangerous of her kind. Cougars are hypercarnivores, meaning that they only eat meat. In Yellowstone National Park, they compete with wolves for elk and deer. Elsewhere, they also hunt smaller mammals such as raccoons, porcupines, and wild turkeys. But they typically hunt at night or during dusk and dawn. So why was this one out in the day? Perhaps it had had an unsuccessful night on the hunt. Perhaps it was very, very hungry. The cougar crouched down low, her belly inches from the ground. Slowly, she crept forwards in the undergrowth, her footsteps silent on the ground, her eyes unblinking. Then she made a dash for it, suddenly running from the woodland towards the boy. She covered the open ground between Jeremy and herself in a second. A flash of brown caught Jeremy's eye, and he looked up and screamed as he saw the 60-pound, 27-kilogram mountain lion launch itself at him. He didn't have time to get up and run. It jumped on top of him, instinctively going for the neck. Her claws dug into his body, and the long canines pierced his throat as it mauled him. The other children screamed and all made a run for the school building. Some rushed inside, shouting for help. They knew their friend was in serious trouble. It was pandemonium. Jeremy was trying to fight back, but he was too small in comparison to the wild cat. He didn't stand a chance. The weight of her body pinned him down, and when she closed her jaws around his throat, he had just seconds to live. Kevin Williams, Jeremy's father, heard the chaos outside and ran to the playground. There, he saw his eldest son underneath the beige-brown cat, his head in its jaws. He ran at the mountain lion, yelling and shouting, trying desperately to distract it and scare it away. He tried to find something to throw at it as he rushed forwards, but time was running out. Although only seconds passed in reality, time seemed to stand still. The attack seemed to go on forever, with Kevin feeling powerless to stop it. Then the school janitor, also hearing the terrified screams of the school children, came running outside with his rifle. He lifted it, took aim, and fired a single shot. The cougar collapsed on the ground next to the youngster, but it was too late. It had already delivered its fatal bite. There was nothing Kevin could do for his son. He held the boy, limp in his arms, whilst his 4-year-old son, Daniel, Jeremy's younger brother, watched on. The death of one of their own shook the close-knit Cayuquit community. It was a tragedy that could so easily have been avoided. Richard Leo, a Cayuquit Indian chief, told the authorities that parents were furious at the school board for not protecting the children from the threat of wild animals. There weren't just cougars out there, there were bears and wolves. Richard said that no pupils would be returning to the school until they had assurances that a fence will be erected around its grounds. Being surrounded by prime cougar and bear habitat, their children needed to be kept safe. A dozen children were in the playground that day. They witnessed one of their friends being killed right before their eyes. And for Daniel, he had watched in horror as his older brother was mauled just feet from where he stood. Professional counseling was provided for those children, and there was an outpouring of support from the local community. It was a tragedy that will never be forgotten by those in Cayuquit. There are some 4,000 cougars in the whole of Canada, 3,500 of which are found in British Columbia. Vancouver Island has the highest concentration of cougars in the world, with around 800 calling the island home. In the past 100 years, 5 people have lost their lives to the mountain lions in British Columbia. Surprisingly, all but one of these occurred on Vancouver Island. During the same period, 29 non-fatal attacks occurred in British Columbia, 20 of which were on the island. The majority of these were on children under the age of 16. Although these attacks are devastating for all involved, they are actually exceedingly rare. But it is the elusiveness of the cougars that makes them so terrifying, knowing that they are out there and that they are born predators with the ability to take down a 600-pound moose. Most Canadians will never see one, but for those that do, it often comes along with their terrifying final affliction.